Hey, my name is Colin Calloway. I'm 28 years old and I run a small cattle ranch on the western edge of Mill Haven, Colorado. It isn't much of a town by most standards. Just a few general stores, a feed supply, a gas station, a little church, and a diner that always smells faintly of burnt coffee in the mornings. The roads are mostly dirt, stretching past pastures, wooden fences, and old barns. I've got maybe 40 head of cattle, a weathered log house, a truck that's seen too many miles, and a list of chores that never seems to end. I'm not rich. I work from sunup to sundown, pay what I owe on time, keep my word, and fall into bed too tired to think about much else. My mother passed 6 years ago. After she was gone, the house grew quiet in a way I didn't know how to fill. No more Sunday baking smells. No more reminders to hang up my coat properly. No one asking if I'd eaten when I came in late. I never said it out loud, but there were nights, after I'd shut the barn and turned off the porch light, when I stood in the empty kitchen and felt the clear shape of what was missing. The Harmon family lives east of me, just across a dirt road, a stretch of pasture and a fence line that runs along a small creek. Daniel Harmon, his wife Ruth, and their daughter Clara. We've been neighbors a long time. When my mother was alive, Ruth would sometimes bring over a pie. When the Harmons needed a gate fixed or a few boards replaced in the barn, I'd go help. Out here, you don't talk much about neighborly duty. If someone needs a hand, you show up. That's just how it works. Clara Harmon is 24. She's the kind of person everyone in town thinks well of. Not because she tries to please people, but because kindness seems to come naturally to her. She wakes early to help her mother at the little bakery on Main Street. Bread, apple pies, butter cookies, and hot coffee for folks passing through. Afternoons she tends the garden, helps her father with the books, and if someone in the valley is sick, she's the one carrying soup or fresh rolls to their door. I'd known Clara for years. I'd eaten supper at their table. I'd seen her set an extra plate when I stopped by to fix something. I'd watched her behind the bakery counter, hair tied back, hands dusted with flour, smiling and calling customers by name. I'd heard her ask her father about the hay supply for the cattle. I'd seen her take soup to old Mr. Briggs when his back was bad. For a long time, though, I only thought of her as the Harmon girl. A good, steady, likable young woman. The kind any man would be lucky to marry someday. I didn't realize I was looking at someone I would one day hate to live without. That summer, the spring rains ran high and washed out 2 sections of fence between my place and the Harmons. One Tuesday afternoon in July, I took my hammer, new posts, wire, and toolbox out to fix it. The sky was clear, sunlight spread across the grass, and a soft wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, sounding almost like someone whispering through the leaves. I was driving in a new post when Clara stepped out the back of her house near the fence line by the water. She carried a basket of laundry. Plenty of folks out here still hang clothes on the line when the weather's good. The wind off the pasture gives everything a clean smell you don't get from a dryer. She set the basket down, stretched the line, and began pinning up shirts and towels one by one. She didn't see me at first. I didn't call out. I kept working, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. Clara moved with a quiet, unhurried sureness. She shook out each piece, smoothed the fabric, and hung it straight. Nothing showy, just ordinary work done well. And for the first time, I noticed how the late light caught in her hair, how there was still a faint trace of flour on her sleeve from the bakery that morning. She looked like someone who made the world around her a little steadier without ever making a fuss about it. Then she glanced up and saw me. "Colin," she said. I rested my hands on the hammer handle. "Clara." She looked at the fence. "Creek got it again?" "Every year." She smiled a little. "Dad keeps saying we ought to set the post deeper on our side, but he keeps putting it off." We talked a bit about the weather, the cattle, how busy the bakery had been that morning, and whether old Mr. Briggs's back was any better. Small things. The kind of talk neighbors have. After a while, she went back to hanging clothes and I went back to the fence. But something had shifted. I found myself watching her longer than I should have. By the end of July, the town held its summer social at the community hall. In Mill Haven, that's the big event of the season. Not big like a city fair, but big enough that most everyone shows up. Long tables of food, pies and grilled meat and potato salad, live music, kids running on the grass, Grown folks talking about hay prices and who was sick and who had just had a baby. I got there and saw the Harmons had already arrived. Daniel in his best shirt, Ruth with her hair pinned neat. Clara wore a simple light blue dress, clean and modest, nothing fancy, but it suited her. She was helping her mother set out the baked goods: apple pies, butter cookies, sweet rolls, and little hand pies the bakery had made that morning. She moved between the tables, talking easily with people she'd known all her life. I stood across the yard and watched her. I told myself it was just coincidence that my eyes kept finding her. But I knew better. 3 different men asked her to dance inside 20 minutes. I saw every one of them. I stayed by the drinks table holding a glass of iced tea, making small talk with folks I knew, but my gaze kept drifting back. After a while, Mrs. Morrison, a widow who'd known me since I was 11, came and stood beside me. She held a cup of lemonade and looked from Clara to me. "Colin," she said, "you've been watching Clara Harmon all evening." I answered too fast. "I haven't." She laughed softly. "Boy, I've known you since you were knee-high. Trust me, you're watching." I didn't argue after that. She patted my arm once and moved on toward the food tables, like she'd simply pointed out something obvious that only I had been pretending not to see. Later, walking home under a sky thick with stars, I stopped in the middle of the dirt road. For the first time, I asked myself honestly why it had bothered me to see other men ask Clara to dance. Why I'd kept looking for her in the crowd. Why the image of her, in that light blue dress standing beside her mother's table of pies, stayed with me long after I'd left. The answer came slow but clear. I wanted to see her every day, not as a neighbor, not as the Harmon girl, but as the woman who could make the quiet rooms in my house feel less empty. I stood there a long time, listening to the crickets, and it felt like I had found something I hadn't even known I was missing. After that night on the road, I started noticing Clara more than I should have. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was small things. The way she waved when she drove past my place in her mother's old truck. The sound of her voice carrying across the pasture when she called to the horses. The fact that I found myself checking the fence line near the creek more often than it needed checking, just in case she happened to be outside. August came in hot and dry. Mr. Briggs's back got worse. He lived alone in a small house at the end of the road, about half a mile from the Harmons. He was a hard man, short on compliments and long on complaints, but the whole valley respected him. Clara started bringing him food every other day, soup one day, fresh bread from the bakery the next, sometimes just a tin of soft cookies because he couldn't chew anything tough anymore. One morning I was up on the roof of the hay shed replacing a few rotten boards when I saw her walking along the road with a basket over her arm. I climbed down without thinking too hard about it, wiped my hands on my jeans and called her name. "Clara." She stopped and turned. "You need something? Mind if I walk with you?" She looked surprised. "You're busy." "It'll keep." "You don't have to." I met her eyes. "I know, I want to." She studied me for a second longer than usual, then nodded once. We walked side by side on the dirt road under the morning sun. I'd never been much of a talker, but with Clara, the quiet didn't feel awkward. She spoke easily about the bakery that morning, how they'd sold out of apple pies, and her mother had been pleased because customers from the next town over had stopped in. She mentioned the creek bank eroding on the south side, how Henderson's corn was shorter than usual this year, and that hay might be expensive if the weather stayed strange. She didn't fill every silence. She just talked when she had something to say, and I found myself listening more carefully than I usually did with people. At Mr. Briggs's place, she warmed the soup on his old stove, tidied the kitchen, checked his firewood stack, and asked whether he'd taken his medicine. He watched her the way a grandfather watches a stubborn granddaughter, then looked over at me with no attempt to hide what he was thinking. When Clara stepped into the other room to get a bowl, he said, low and direct, "You're a damn fool if you don't see what's standing right in front of you." I went still. From the kitchen, I heard a spoon clatter against the counter. Clara's ears had gone red. I kept my voice down. "I'm working on it." Mr. Briggs made a sound in his throat. "Don't work on it too long. Good women don't wait around forever." On the walk back, Clara and I didn't mention what he'd said, but the silence between us had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt full of something neither of us was ready to name yet. A few days later, it was Tuesday again. I'd started thinking of Tuesdays as strange days in my life. I was checking the section of fence I'd already repaired near the creek when I heard Clara on the other side. She was carrying another basket of laundry, kitchen towels from the bakery, a couple of white aprons, and some gardening shirts. She began hanging them on the line, humming under her breath, not loud enough for anyone but herself. I stood there watching longer than I should have. The sky was clear, the cottonwoods moved in the wind, the creek ran steady, and Clara was doing something ordinary with a kind of quiet grace she didn't seem to notice in herself. When she saw me, she lifted a hand. I walked closer to the fence. We talked about the weather, the cattle, Mr. Briggs, Henderson's corn. She told me about a customer who had dropped an entire box of cookies right outside the bakery that morning, and how her mother had been half annoyed and half amused. I found myself smiling more easily than usual. Then there was a comfortable pause. Neither of us rushed to fill it. Clara shook out another apron and pinned it to the line, her hands quick and sure. I thought about what Mrs. Morrison had said at the social. I thought about what Mr. Briggs had said in his kitchen. I thought about standing in the middle of the road that night and realizing I wanted to see this woman every single day. The words came out before I could stop them. You know, Clara, whoever ends up marrying you is going to be a very lucky man. I said it like a simple observation. I expected her to laugh, maybe duck her head and tell me I was being ridiculous, and then we'd go back to normal. Instead, she went still. Both hands stayed on the apron. Color rose slowly in her face. Not sudden, but steady, like someone turning up a lamp. She didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, the look in her eyes made my throat go tight. It was open and frightened and decided all at once. She spoke so quietly, I almost didn't hear her over the sound of the creek. I've been hoping it would be you. I stood on my side of the fence and couldn't find any words. The water kept moving. Leaves rustled. A bird crossed the sky. But something between us had shifted, and I knew it wasn't going back to what it was before. Clara, I managed. Because I've never been good at circling around things, I just told the truth. I meant it. She held my gaze. I know. That's why I said what I said. I swallowed. How long have you been thinking about this? She pinned the last apron to the line before she answered. Since the summer social. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She gave me a small, teasing look. Maybe even before that. I just hadn't named it yet. I laughed once, surprised and relieved at the same time. So, I was slower than you. Quite a bit slower, she said, and the tension between us eased. I looked at her across the fence, this girl I'd known for years, close enough that I thought I already understood her. Turned out I was only just starting to see her. Would you let me come to the house properly? I asked. I'd like to talk to your father. She lifted the empty basket. Dad likes you. I felt a flicker of relief until she added, he's been hoping you'd figure this out for about a year now. She turned and walked toward her house. I stayed by the fence long after she disappeared inside. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was gratitude. Gratitude that I hadn't missed her completely. Gratitude that she'd been brave enough to answer honestly when she could have laughed it off. Gratitude that something this big had started with one clumsy sentence beside a creek while she hung laundry in the afternoon light. The next evening, I put on the cleanest shirt I owned, combed my hair, and drove the short distance to the Harmon place. I was more nervous than the first time I hauled cattle over the mountain pass in a rainstorm. I'm not a timid man, but standing on their porch that night felt like stepping into something that mattered more than anything I'd done in years. Daniel Harmon was already sitting in one of the chairs on the porch. That told me Clara had spoken to him. He's a tall man with a quiet presence, silver in his beard, and eyes that don't need to raise their voice to make you feel seen. He didn't make me stand there long. He just nodded toward the chair beside him. Sit down, Colin. I sat. We looked out toward the hills turning dark in the west. After a while, I said what I'd come to say. I'd like your permission to court Clara properly. He stayed quiet for a long moment. I felt my pulse in my throat. Then he asked, why now? I turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the horizon, voice even. I'm asking honestly. Ruth and I have been watching you find your way toward her for nearly 2 years. There were times we thought about saying it straight to your face. Heat climbed up my neck. I was slow. He nodded once. Steady, though. That's the kinder word for it. I didn't know whether to laugh or stay silent, so I stayed silent. He went on. Clara doesn't ask for much. She's used to taking care of other people first, at the bakery, at home. She can do a lot without complaining, but that doesn't mean she doesn't need to be seen. She deserves a man who sees her clearly. I answered without rushing. I see her. Daniel turned and looked at me for a long time. Then he gave one short nod. Supper's usually at 6. Ruth always cooks extra. From that night on, I started showing up at the Harmon house more often. Not as the neighbor who came to fix things anymore, but as someone who had been given permission to step into their lives. The first week I ate supper there 4 times. Ruth set an extra plate without making a production of it. Clara sat across from me, glancing up now and then, under the warm kitchen light and smiling small when our eyes met. Daniel asked about the cattle, the fence, the price of hay. Ruth talked about the bakery. Clara added dry, quiet comments that made the whole table laugh. On the 4th evening that week, after we'd eaten, Clara and I walked out to the edge of their land. The last light of sunset was still on the grass. We talked about my ranch, about the bakery, about the winter coming, about small things and a few larger ones. I asked her, "Are you happy with your life here, in Mill Haven, with the bakery and the ranch and the way things move?" She thought before she answered. Clara never spoke just to please someone. I think happiness is mostly something you make, not something you find. People who spend all their time looking for it somewhere else usually miss what they already have. She looked at me. What about you? I looked toward my own house in the distance. I think I'm happier than I've been in a long time. October arrived cold and clear, frost on the grass in the mornings. The getting to know you between Clara and me happened at the pace of 2 people who lived by work. Never much free time, but always finding small pockets for each other. I came for supper. We walked out to the creek. I drove her into town when she needed more flour or boxes for the bakery. She helped me sort through the messy ledger for the ranch because she was better with numbers than I was. I brought her wildflowers from the north pasture. Not bought flowers, just ones I saw and thought she might like. She pressed them between the pages of a book without saying much. But a few days later, I noticed they were neatly arranged there. One afternoon after the bakery closed early, she tried to teach me how to make an apple pie. I ruined the first attempt. The crust was too thick and the filling ran everywhere. Clara looked at it for a few seconds, then said, "It has personality." "Is that your way of saying it's bad?" She smiled. "It's my way of saying you'll do better next time." And I did. I fixed the sticking gate at their place without mentioning it to anyone. 2 weeks later, Daniel shook my hand when I was leaving. He didn't say a word about the gate, but the handshake said enough. There was one night in the middle of October when I was walking across the field toward their house for supper and I stopped. Their lights were on, warm and steady. I knew that inside there would be the smell of something baking, Ruth's voice in the kitchen, Daniel at the table, and Clara listening for my footsteps so she could open the door before I knocked. And because it all felt so right, I got scared. I'd grown used to not wanting anything too clearly. Wanting something outright means you can lose it outright. I'd lost my mother. I'd lost the feeling of having a real home waiting for me. For years, I'd lived like it was enough to just work, pay what I owed, and keep everything steady. But Clara made me want more. I stood in the middle of that field for 10 minutes. Then I kept walking. She opened the door before I could knock. "You're late," she said. "The cookies are almost cold." I stepped into the warm house, looked at her, and thought, this is what I almost didn't let myself have. That night at the table, Clara said something I've remembered ever since. She said it was easier to talk to me than to a lot of people she'd known for years. I asked, "Why do you think that is?" She thought about it. "Because you actually listen. A lot of people are just waiting for their turn to speak." I looked at her across the table. "I learned that from you." She smiled. "Good. When you decide to try, you learn fast." I smiled back, but inside I was very sure of one thing. I wanted to hear Clara say things like that for the rest of my life. I asked Clara to marry me in November, right at the fence by the creek. At first I thought maybe I should take her up on the hill where you can see the whole valley at sunset. I thought a proposal ought to have a beautiful view, something planned and memorable. The longer I thought about it, though, the more I knew that wasn't right for us. Our story didn't start on a hilltop. It started here, beside this creek, between this fence and a clothesline, with one honest, clumsy sentence. I'd been carrying my mother's ring in my pocket for 3 weeks. It was a plain silver band with a small stone. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, but it was what she had left behind. And to me it stood for a house, for staying power, for the kind of love that doesn't make noise but doesn't leave either. The afternoon I chose, the cottonwoods had turned yellow and were starting to drop their leaves. There was a sharp edge to the air, the first real bite of winter. Clara had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. We stood near the water, close to the section of fence where she had once hung white bakery aprons in the sun. "Clara," I said. She turned. I took the ring out. I had imagined I would speak smoothly, but when I saw the way she was looking at me, all I could do was tell the truth in the simplest way I knew. I know I was slow. I know it took me longer than it should have to see what was right in front of me. But I see it now. I see you clearly every day. I see how you take care of people, how you do the quiet work no one notices, how you make a house, a table, a small bakery, a road, an ordinary day feel like it matters. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't speak yet. "I want to keep seeing you every day," I went on. "I want to build a life with you. A house, a family, something we make together. Clara Harmon, I want you to marry me." She looked at me for a long time. Then a smile broke across her face, so real it couldn't be hidden. "Colin Calloway," she said, "you certainly took your time." I laughed and my throat tightened at the same time. "Is that a yes?" "Of course it's a yes." I slipped my mother's ring onto her finger right there by the creek, under the yellow trees. She looked down at it for a while. I knew she wasn't studying the stone. She was looking at the life it represented. Then she lifted her face, and I kissed her for the first time. The creek kept running the way it always had. The cottonwoods kept letting go of their leaves. But for me, everything had changed. When we told her parents, Ruth cried. Not sad tears, relieved, happy ones. The kind a mother cries when she's been watching something come together for a long time. She held Clara's hand, looked at the ring, then looked at me. "I always knew it would be you." Daniel stood on the other side of the room and gave one short nod. He didn't say much, but that nod carried more weight than most people's speeches. The next morning, I stopped at the feed store. Pete, the man behind the counter, looked at me for a second and said, "About time." I heard some version of "finally" or "about time" from several people that week. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Briggs, a couple of the men at church. I started to understand that what had been growing between Clara and me had been obvious to the whole town long before I was willing to name it. That winter was the happiest one I'd had in years, even though it wasn't easy. In rural Colorado, winter isn't romantic. It's snow packed against the fences, cattle that need checking in the cold, pumps that can freeze, wood that has to be split, roofs that need reinforcing against the wind, and hands that crack from the dry air. But now there was Clara in it with me. Supper at the Harmon house twice a week. Walks home together under cold skies, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. Mornings when I stopped by the bakery just to see her behind the counter, smiling as she asked, "Are you pretending you need bread again today?" "Not pretending," I'd answer. "The bread here really is good." She would laugh, and the rest of my day would sit lighter in my chest. I also started working on the house. I didn't talk about it much with Clara, but I did the work. I fixed the kitchen so it was decent, replaced the old floorboards in the main room, built a few shelves, repaired the porch. And most of all, I cut in a new window on the east wall of the kitchen so the morning light would come in properly. I did it because of her. Because I figured a woman who got up early to bake bread and stand in the smell of flour and hot coffee might like a kitchen with good light in the morning. In February, Clara came with her mother to look at the house and figure out where things would go after the wedding. When she stepped into the kitchen and saw the new window, she stopped. Morning light poured across the table I had refinished. You did this without telling me? She asked. I did. Why facing east? I looked at her. Because I thought you'd like good light in the mornings. She was quiet for a long time. Then she walked over and took my hand. She held it tightly, the way someone holds onto something they intend to keep. Thank you, she said. Just those two words, nothing more dramatic, nothing longer. But I understood she wasn't only thanking me for a window. She was thanking me for thinking of her during the winter, before she even lived here, for making space for her in a house that had once been only mine. I realized then that love doesn't always need big announcements. Sometimes it's just quietly turning toward the east, waiting for the person you love to walk into the light. The wedding happened on a Saturday in April. After a week of spring rain, the sky was clear and bright. The cottonwoods were just starting to leaf out. The hills around Mill Haven were a fresh, new green. The air smelled of damp earth, young grass, and wildflowers. Half the town came. It wasn't a fancy wedding. No big hotel, no expensive band, no elaborate dinner. We held it on the grass near the Harmon house. Wooden chairs in rows, wildflowers picked from the fields, food that neighbors brought, and plenty of baked goods from Ruth's bakery. Clara had told her mother not to go overboard, but Ruth still made enough apple pies, butter cookies, sweet rolls, and small hand pies to feed the whole county. Clara wore a simple dress her mother had made, ivory with a modest neckline and small hand-embroidered details. Nothing showy. It suited her perfectly, clean, gentle, and exactly right. When Daniel walked her toward me, I thought, I still can't believe there was a time I was this slow. Pastor Mills kept the ceremony short. He was always better with fewer words, so he used fewer. When he asked who was giving the bride away, Daniel's voice broke a little. A few people in the chairs wiped their eyes, including some of the men who pretended they were just looking at their boots. I said my vows to Clara while looking straight at her. I promised I would see her every day, not only when she was strong and kind and taking care of everyone else, but also when she was tired, when she needed to be held, when she didn't want to be the steady one anymore. I promised I wouldn't let her love me in silence. I promised I would walk beside her, steady even if I was slow, and build a life we made together. Clara's vows were quiet and clear. She said she had waited for me to see her, but what she loved was my steadiness, my honesty, and the fact that I had finally stepped forward even though it took me a long time. She said happiness wasn't something that would fall from the sky. It was something we would make day after day, then we were married. Mr. Carson played fiddle. People ate and laughed and danced on the grass until the sun went down. Mr. Briggs sat in the front row, grumbling that the music was too loud, but I saw him wipe his eyes twice. Near the end of the evening, Mrs. Morrison walked past me and said only one thing. I told you so. I smiled. This time I didn't argue. That night, Clara came home to my house, our house now. The floors were new, the kitchen was fixed, and the east window let in clean morning light. She sat at the kitchen table with her hair down after the long day, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked around the room, then looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. She was no longer the neighbor girl across the fence. She was no longer the girl I had to ask permission to court. She was my wife, the woman who would wake up here, eat here, laugh here, cry here, and grow old here with me. We're going to be very happy here, she said. You know that, don't you? I know. She tilted her head. When did you know? I smiled. Maybe later than you. Clara smiled back. But you got here. I reached across the table and took her hand. I got here. The years that followed weren't a fairy tale. We worked hard. There were seasons when hay was expensive, when cattle got sick, when storms knocked down fences, when money was tight for months at a time. But the life we built was made of ordinary days and the choice to keep choosing each other. The ranch grew. In the second year, we built a new barn. In the third, we improved the pasture. Clara took over the books because she was better with numbers, and we both knew it. She still helped her mother at the bakery on busy mornings, especially in winter. Sometimes she brought home warm loaves, and the house that had once felt cold always smelled of bread and butter. She also started a small group of women in the valley who shared tools, seeds, canned goods, and extra food during hard seasons. She never thought it was anything important, but people in Mill Haven still talk about it years later. Our son was born in the spring of the third year. We named him Daniel after her father. He came into the world with strong lungs and strong opinions. Clara said he was like me. I said he was like her. The truth was probably both. 2 years after that, our daughter arrived. I named her Margaret, after my mother. She had Clara's eyes and my stubborn streak. Clara called it a dangerous combination. I called it perfect. One Tuesday afternoon in the fifth autumn after our wedding, I was repairing the fence by the creek again after high water, the same way I always did. Clara came down with both children. She carried a small basket of laundry, kitchen towels, and the kids' clothes. She set it near the line the same way she used 2 years ago. Daniel ran ahead, yelling for me to lift him onto my shoulders. Margaret toddled behind with a serious little face as if the whole world should wait for her to catch up. Clara lifted a hand and waved, exactly like she had on that first summer day. I climbed over the fence, lifted Margaret into my arms, and let Daniel scramble onto my shoulders. They immediately started arguing about who got the better spot while Clara laughed. After we negotiated peace, the children played in the grass and Clara leaned her head against my shoulder. The cottonwoods were yellow again. The creek still ran. Small towels moved on the line in the wind. Everything was different and exactly the same. "Do you still remember that first summer?" she asked. "By this fence. You told me whoever married me would be very lucky." "I remember." She looked at the two children, then toward our house in the distance. "You were right." I looked at her. "I'm the lucky one." Clara shook her head, practical as she had always been. "We both are." I pulled her closer. "Yeah, both of us." That afternoon, I stood among my wife, my two children, the old fence, the old creek, and the old clothesline, and I understood clearly what I had almost missed. I had almost missed Clara, not because she was far away, but because she had been right beside me the whole time, in the suppers at her parents' house, in the bakery, in the soup she carried to Mr. Briggs, in the laughter at the summer social, in the lights of her house across the pasture. I used to believe the important things in life had to be found somewhere distant. But the biggest thing in my life had been here all along, doing ordinary work, waiting for me to be brave enough to see it. I wasn't a coward. I was simply someone who had grown used to not wanting anything too clearly, because wanting it meant I could lose it. But Clara taught me that some things are worth wanting, even when wanting them is frightening. And the luckiest thing that ever happened to me was that on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon beside the creek, I finally told the truth. Clara, who was braver than I was, told the truth back. From that one sentence, our whole life began.